Now, a couple of days ago, this ISIS thing is an interesting one actually. A couple of days ago I was late to work, so I grabbed a cab. And 5 minutes into the journey, never spoken to taxi driver until that point, except telling my destination. He elbows me and he says, "What's the story with them ISIS fellas? You'll know it." I mean, I have a couple of options, of course. Turn into a rampaging lion, and he leaves his taxi to me, or just talk to him, actually. But obviously, I mean, people are thinking about ISIS, people seeing ISIS everywhere, on TV and everything. So I didn't turn into a lion or anything like that. I just told him, I don't know, I'm from Donegal, how would I know? So I think he's confused. He was confused. I texted him though, because I have his number on Halo to attend this meeting, but he said no. There you go. Look, I mean, someone once said, only a handful of times in our history has a generation been confronted with challenges so vast, an economy that is faltering, 2 wars, one that needs to be ended responsibly, one that needs to be waged wisely, a planet that is warming from our unsustainable dependence on oil. This wasn't a Marxist anti-war environmentalist philosopher. This was Barack Obama in 2009. And someone from the past actually answered him, maybe 100 years ago. History repeats itself, he said. First as a tragedy, second as a time as a farce. So the whole situation at the moment with ISIS, US, the air raids, is a farce. It's a farce that costs us millions of people their lives, thousands of people their lives, millions of people their livelihood, etc. And it's turning the whole region, yet again, into a complete mess. And it's a very complex situation as well. I mean, it's not in the sense like 2003, where there was this isolated, relatively isolated Saddam and the rest of the democratic world. Now we are talking about in Iraq, where the sectarian divide is since 2004-5 actually is horrible. We have the Syrian situation, where the Syrian revolution has stalled, and multiple forces, sectarian, progressive, revolutionary forces, and Assad are at each other's throat. We have the situation in Kurdistan, and that's not one country, that's Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and the fight between the Kurdish forces and the ISIS, and Kurdish forces defending the Kurdish region. And then, of course, there is this sort of interesting situation with the sub-imperialist countries, like Turkey, for example, who is doing a hard bargain with their imperialist masters, the US, in terms of its support to ISIS. I mean, that's the Turkish support to ISIS. In terms of its fear of the Kurdish national movement, and in terms of its being under pressure from the US, having to do something about ISIS. And then you have also another situation where around 3 years ago, Qatar, Bahrain, with the go-ahead of the US, had created a number of sectarian reactionary radical jihadist forces to fight against Assad, but not just to fight against Assad, of course, to also drown the revolution, because God help, the Qataris and the Bahrainis wouldn't like to see in Syria people rising up and overthrowing dictatorships, would they? And these forces have now become part of ISIS, or the part of umbrella that we know as ISIS. And of course, there is also an increasing support to sort of ISIS from various other jihadist forces, from North Africa to Afghanistan, actually. So this is the sort of complexity of the situation, and none of this complexity, none of this sort of dynamics, and none of the horrors that this complexity actually is creating is actually presented on the mainstream media. We hear about all sorts of things, about ISIS, etc., but we don't hear about these things. Just a quick memory, I suppose, recap, right? In 2003 and in 2001, and I'm not going to go into that in great detail, we were told the world will be a safer place. If Taliban is gone, if Al-Qaeda is gone, if Saddam is gone, and hundreds of thousands of people marched in the streets of European cities and the cities of the world, right? Fast forward back to this day, Iraq is square zero. We are back to a situation where in 2003, possibly things weren't as bad as they are now. So then we have a situation where Assad was an ally during the first Iraqi invasion. Now he's an enemy, but he's turning back to become maybe a kind of an ally. Iran, all these years, were going to be decimated. Now maybe they can talk to Iraq, maybe, possibly, Iran, I mean, if Iran will cooperate in terms of ISIS. I mean, the sub-imperialist other countries, Jordan, Turkey, they are a bit problematic for the US at the moment. Afghanistan is still ongoing. Only yesterday there was an attack on the NATO convoy, killing 3 NATO members, soldiers. The Gulf states, I think, are in an explosive situation, from Saudi Arabia to Bahrain to Qatar. They are in an explosive situation. They are not safe from all of these people's revolt and uprisings, etc. And of course, the wider situation in the world, which I'm sure Kieran will talk about. So, I mean, ISIS has become an excuse to go in there, replacing Saddam. But God, it's not a clean and clear excuse for the Americans to do what they want to do, right? So it's very complicated in that sense. I mean, one person I hate, but I follow, is Tony Blair. I hate him, but I follow him, right? I think he's a war criminal, but he knows things. I mean, he said only 2-3 weeks ago, bombing ISIS from the air is not going to work. One has to go in, like we did in 2003. US generals now are saying, we are now opening up another 10 years of, at least, active fighting in Iraq and Syria. And Robert Fisk in 2003 had said something similar, so I just robbed it from him. But I think the US doesn't want to go in. It can't go in, as things are standing, but it may have to go in, but it won't go in into Iraq and Syria. So that's the problem for US in a sense. So, and that's why US is putting a lot of pressure on the regional allies to do its business. But US also has a very complicated question to answer. The question is, let's say ISIS was defeated, decimated, gone, right? Who is US going to rely in Syria and Iraq to do its business? Who are the next allies of US? Are the Shiites who have been actually, given the sort of symbolic power, but they themselves are suffering, or the Sunnis who are definitely not happy with the US? Is it Assad, again the friend, or Iran, or the new Iraqi prime minister, or who? Or the Kurds maybe? So who's going to do the sort of dirty oil business of capitalism smoothly for US? I don't think they know this answer, and I don't think they have a quick answer to this one. So when we talk about ISIS, right, the first thing we saw about ISIS is this shock and awe. That was the US propaganda, that was the US method, but the ISIS shocked and horrified the West. How did they do it? Beheadings, videos of beheadings. I mean, 46 people in Saudi Arabia were beheaded. That's not a share on Twitter. But God, ISIS beheaded someone. Horrible thing, of course, to do. No one will even go close to defend it. But that was the horror. Or the number of fighters, 5,000, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000, or the amount of money they have. It became almost like a sort of an ISIS porn, in a sense, in social media. Or the sort of the anti-hero in the movies style dressing ISIS fighters. They're almost glorified in their own horrible, scary dresses and everything. So, and the women slaves that were sold on markets in their hundreds of thousands, etc. about ISIS. So ISIS is a sort of has become this phenomenon that we don't hear the realities about, we don't hear the real problems about, but we hear all about sort of the myths, mystical things about them. And we don't discuss the realities, we discuss the beheadings. Of course we should, but we should discuss it within context, I suppose, right? And ISIS, of course, is a direct outcome. It's not just a cliche to say. It is true. It's a direct outcome of the 2003 Iraq invasion and what has been happening since then. Sectarian force that has sort of used the situation in Syria, with this revolution being stalled, and used the situation in Iraq, and has captured, has taken control, basically. Of course, when you look at the people of Middle East, and when you look at what US has done, and when you look at what ISIS is saying, there's also anger still because of Afghanistan, isn't there? People haven't forgotten, have they? Women being decimated by drone attacks and everything. I mean, ISIS is using Palestine as an excuse and as a propaganda tool, and they actually published a 12-point plan. Geez, they're worse than Fine Gael. And they said, once we achieve those 12-point plan, we are going to go and attack Israel and liberate the Palestinians. So Palestine, and people do know in the region, Palestine is a terrible situation, right? And the hypocrisy and the brutality of the US and the Israelis. Of course, the Syrian revolution being stalled is what gave them an excuse. And what we see now is a sectarian force that is really bad and an imperialist force that is really worse, trying to clean its previous mess with a bigger, newer mess. So mess after mess is the situation actually, right? I mean, just very briefly, in 2003, when then the Iraqi Prime Minister Maliki went to Washington to have discussions with the White House, there were on average 70 bombings in Iraq. 7,000 people were killed in just 1 year, civilians, and thousands were wounded, right? And we have been hearing these things as this supposedly the ancient Sunni, Shia, Kurd, Arab sectarian fighting, which is utter nonsense, utter lie. Shias and Sunnis were intermarrying each other. Shias and Kurds and Arabs were living together in that country once called Iraq, right? And we remember the Paul Bremmers and everything of this world, how he decimated the country not only militaristically, not in terms of destroying the infrastructure, but also in terms of economy, right? So this sort of Iraq, which was left behind for ISIS to sort of use and take control of, basically. Now, Syria, of course, where ISIS came to exist in a sense, right? The revolution has stopped. Assad brutally attacked revolutionaries, okay? And Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, they all have been involved in this process. Again, as I said earlier on, not to help anyone on the revolutionary side, but to just draw it and control it, basically, right? And meanwhile, Assad, for example, as he realized he might lose that war, has released at least 1,000 jihadi fighters in prison. He just released them because he knew once he created multiple dimensions to this revolutionary process, it will be a mess. And he might yet actually come out of this as at least sort of relatively a winner, right? So that's the sort of situation. I mean, ISIS claims itself as being the caliphate of modern days and refers to sort of ancient times, etc., which is obviously a fantasy. They're not looking backwards, they're looking forwards in a sense, not in a progressive sense, but they obviously are not trying to go back to 630s, etc. They want to use that situation as much as they can to assert their authority, basically, right? And it draws strength also from disillusioned revolutionary forces, progressive forces rather, not revolutionary forces, or what the Western media will call modest Islamic forces. I mean, the national resistance in Iraq has obviously fallen apart. People have been marginalized. And also there are fighters now in Syria and Iraq who are joining ISIS, and guess what their commonality is? They all are from countries once US bombed or have been bombing at the moment. And then there are people from West joining ISIS. Why is that, do you think? Pakistanis, Afghanis, Yemenis, Turks, who are actually so pissed off, depressed, and angry about what the West has been doing and the hypocrisies, they're going and joining ISIS in the absence of a strong revolutionary force that will fight in Iraq and Syria, right? So that's the situation. So, I mean, ISIS has a lot of money, we know that. They're not just mad men who just go and behead people. They are mad, but that madness has a logic to it. I mean, they're publishing a journal, for example. I mean, All Irish Marxist Review is probably less professional than their journal, and they publish 150,000 copies in 4 different languages. They talk about imperialism, they talk about Palestine, they talk about West, they talk about capitalism, they talk about imperialism, and they translate into 4 different languages, and they distribute it, right? And they're controlling through that sort of vast network, they're distributing it, right? So, and guess what happens when the US actually goes in and says, I'm going to bomb ISIS because, hey, NATO, US, we're all humanitarian forces. Wherever there is oil, we bring humanitarian, right? Look, I mean, radical Islamic forces are not necessarily always in tandem with each other, and they not always comply with each other's demands and styles and techniques. They actually have competition sometimes for regional control or national control. The Pakistani Taliban has always been at odds with ISIS, right? Has always been, especially when ISIS broke off from Al-Qaeda, the Iraqi Syrian Al-Qaeda, right? Guess what they did a month ago? They said, when imperialism attacks our Muslim brothers and sisters, we will put aside our differences. And Pakistani Taliban is supporting ISIS. Doesn't mean much, may not, but Afghanistan may turn into another escalating bloodshed, basically. The Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, a small movement, but God, Uzbekistan is a very radicalized place. And America has a lot of interest in Uzbekistan. They support ISIS. The Islamic Front, set up by Qatar and Bahrain to fight Assad, and actually was against ISIS and was fighting ISIS, has stopped fighting ISIS. Al-Nusra stopped fighting ISIS. Ahrar al-Sham, a militant radical Islamic group in Syria, is now on the side of ISIS. Al-Qaeda in the North African part of the world have declared, have published a press statement saying we are supporting ISIS because they have been bombed and they are our brothers and sisters. Al-Qaeda in Yemen, that US always has a problem with, are supporting ISIS basically. So this is what the air bombing has created, yet again. I mean, the ISIS leadership is using this as a sort of anti-imperialist propaganda, using this as a sort of an Islamic propaganda to rally around its own competitors in the region to fight the Americans first, and then we'll deal with, with our own internal issues. So this is what happens when US goes in. This is what happens when US brings democracy and humanitarian to people. More people die, and today in Iraq, in Syria, God, if two people came together and spoke politics, they will be decimated there and then. On the ground from ISIS, from the sky by the US. So once a revolutionary force that had the chance to defeat Assad, once the great people of Iraq, who actually were resisting the US imperialism after 2003, in 2004-5 period, have been so much disintegrated by all of this imperialist regional and international imperialist forces, they are actually in a situation where sky is US, ground ISIS, and that's a terrible, terrible situation for them. So, will ISIS win? I don't believe it will win. Very briefly, I'm going to finish on that one, right? Because they have Shiites to deal with. They have the Kurds to deal with. They have the Gulf states to deal with. Do you think the Gulf states will leave actually a force like ISIS operate within those borders freely? No. They have Iran to deal with. They have various alliances and various sort of corporations, various sort of competitions to deal with. I don't think ISIS will win. But do I think the US will win? No, they won't win either. So what will happen? The ordinary people will suffer, the ordinary people will die, and the people will be sort of pushed into further sectarianism, but there is hope. In the sense that, for example, in Mosul, no one reported that. Shame on the Western media, shame on every media that hasn't reported that. 2,000 Iraqi oil workers in Mosul, Sunni, Shiite, Kurd, Arabs, they had a one-day strike. It wasn't about religion, it wasn't about ISIS, it wasn't about US imperialism. It was about working conditions and pensions. So there is the hope, of course. There's always the hope. There was hope for water charges here. There's hope for Iraqis and Syrians in the region, in a sense, if you know what I mean. I mean, at times, West can look at these regions and actually get really into the propaganda of the imperialism and be depressed. But there is hope. These people have survived for thousands and thousands of years, and they will survive. So what do we take? What do we do? We can prescribe solutions. It's the people of the region who will rise up and who will defeat these imperialists and regional forces. What do we say? First of all, the fight of the Kurds against ISIS.
Implications. If you thought there was only going to be one global superpower, and if you were, for example, on the leadership of the Palestine Liberation Army, the Liberation Organization, which had been in reality supported by Russia, what you found was an attempt to reposition your national movement into being, if you like, in the US orbit. And this to some extent explains the big shifts in terms of the PLO, and to some extent even the dropping of the left-wing rhetoric that they had. They had much more left-wing rhetoric in the 80s of Sinn Féin, trying to find a link to American imperialism, welcoming Bill Clinton here, and so on. So these were the predominant views after 1989. You look at the situation today and you find both these views do not make sense. Far from the end of history, we see absolute chaos breaking out in the world. I mean, Memet's described graphically what's happening in the Middle East. But if you look at Ukraine, one of the biggest, if you like, landmass countries in Europe, 4,000 people killed in war. Probably in the next few months, all-out war about to begin again. 1 million people displaced. You look at places like Pakistan, absolute horror inflicted on people. Areas that we've dominated the news media for a while. Libya, for example, completely war-torn, a country utterly destroyed. And you see, therefore, the idea that history has ended, America's going to rule the world, that's not actually the situation. Now, we in the SPP have always been a strong anti-imperialist party, and I really want to urge people to adopt this view. Sometimes it's very difficult. I mean, if you're looking at people being bombed in Benghazi, or you look at ISIS beheading people and so on, the natural response of people is to say, can we bring in an outside force that's going to impose order and put a bit of peace and stability on what's happening there? When you actually look at the results, and this is the point of all this, if you look at what happened in Iraq, you look at what happened in Libya, every intervention by an imperialist power, no matter how much it's dressed up in humanitarianism, women's rights, whatever so-called progressive rhetoric they use, every intervention of imperialism pushes a country back in two ways. Either sometimes, because in order to rule the country, they have, the imperialists, America or British Empire in the past, have to find the most reactionary elements in that country, promote them, and get them to be dominant. You look, for example, at India. How did a few 100,000 troops in India, British troops, run India? By forming an alliance with the worst right-wing, reactionary landlords in India to push Indian society back. Or sometimes they provoke movements like ISIS, which, as we see, is pushing countries backwards. So in all situations, we, as socialists, will argue against imperialist intervention, no matter how difficult the situation is, because no matter how difficult the situation is, it gets worse once you bring the imperialists in. We go further. We will also support any genuine national liberation movement that is fighting back against imperialism, no matter what their views are. Precisely because imperialism pushes countries backwards, people often fight back in the name of religion, in the name of culture, whatever. People fight back against imperialism. And socialists, particularly in the Western world, have to make a decision. Are we simply going to twiddle our thumbs, say neutral, and say American imperialism is bad, Hamas or whoever is bad? We're just neutral because we're nice Western progressive left-wingers and we're not going to take a stance. That is not our view. Our view is you should stand on the side of people fighting against imperialism. You can argue with them, you can challenge their ideas, but you have to get imperialism out of the area. Those, if you like, are some general principles that we have stood for some time. Now let's look at the situation today, because the situation today is confusing to many people on the left, and if you like, there needs to be a little bit of clarity on where we're going. First of all, what do we mean by imperialism? We mean the attempt of a ruling elite in a dominant industrial power to subordinate the military, political or economic structures of a weaker country to their rule. And this, as we know, has happened for many decades in human history. The question really is, why does it happen in modern capitalism? Why do we still, in modern capitalism, have some character in the Pentagon who wants to dominate rural parts of Pakistan or get into Libya and so on? Why does this actually happen? And generally speaking, there have been two views on the nature of imperialism, historically. One comes from the writer Hobson, writing in 19th century England, who essentially argued imperialism was dysfunctional for capitalism. It was a wrong policy. It was a stupid policy. There was no point Britain going in, taking parts of Africa. They should have, if you like, just built up British industry. That was, if you like, the classic liberal view on imperialism. Against that, Lenin and Bukharin argued that imperialism arises from the dynamic of capitalism itself. Capitalism is a system that starts off companies competing. These companies eventually get to be monopolies or oligopolies. They grow closer to their state. Think of Apple, how close it is to the American state. And competition grows over from economic competition into political military competition. The US state wants greater and greater control over the world so that its companies, Apple and so on, begin to get greater influence. So therefore, and the same thing, by the way, happens with China. I'll come to this in a minute, with Chinese companies, with Russian companies, and so on, right? You get this process, and therefore imperialism is a system. It's not just one big bad guy called the US, it is a system that is driven out of, if you like, capitalist competition. And crucially, because of the nature of capitalism, it is a very uneven, very unstable type of system. You look, for example, at the British Empire in the 19th century. Controlled most of the world, and then blindsided by Germany, who begins to invest in chemical industries and new technologies, you find suddenly it is competing against Germany. And that is the nature of it. It's always uneven, there's always shifts and changes, and it's from that arises the need to enforce military domination. So therefore, what I want to argue very simply is that imperialism is, just to repeat, a system. It is not just big, bad America. America is big and bad, but it's not just big, the American elite, that is, sorry. It's not just American imperialism. It's very important we understand this in the current situation. Okay, let's just look at two examples to illustrate how this works in practice. Let's look at what's completely off the news media, but where there is in fact the biggest threat in terms of conflagration in the future, the biggest military build-up happening in our world at the moment, and that is in the South China Sea. You find, for example, over the last 10 years, there is massive military investment going there. The Chinese army, for example, has increased its military spending by 700%. America has adopted a policy of encircling China with military bases stretching from Thailand to Vietnam to the Philippines, and America has set out very deliberately to construct an alliance of Japan, India, the Philippines, and so on. Therefore, we're looking at, quite literally, a race to see who is going to dominate the South China Sea, and in particular a place called the Malacca Strait, through which, one of the choke points, through which half of the world's merchandise fleet goes through, because now China is a big industrial power. So what do we see happening here? We see a country like China, originally a relatively poorer country, growing massively, but what's actually happening with that growth is, on one hand, the Chinese regime beginning to arm itself, the American regime, if you like, trying to encircle China to stop its growth, competition growing from capitalist competition into, if you like, essentially political and military competition. And therefore, it's not entirely surprising you find that the US Navy, in their internal magazine Proceedings, starts writing articles about how we can lay mines, how we can have warfare with China to stop, to essentially choke their trade. So here's an example of imperialism, if you like, off the headlines, but beginning to emerge. You look at what situation in the Ukraine, and again, a situation that has often confused many people, and there are, and I can't have time to go into it, there are many internal dynamics in Ukrainian history, the collapse of the Ukrainian economy, the manner in which people have been divided by oligarchs who want to play one group against another. But crucial to it is the attempt by the EU, and behind the EU, to move into the borderlands, as it's known in Russia, to take control, to get a grip of that area. And it's not just big bad America. What does the thug who runs Kremlin do? He's also saying, I'm not letting my imperialist rival get in here, and therefore what Russia, being a weaker imperialist power, does is it adopts a strategy of sending so-called volunteers in, of playing ethnic conflict, just as it did, for example, in Georgia in the past, of stoking up tension in order to protect their patch. So what we find happening in Ukraine is two imperialist powers meddling, trying to take control, leading to bloodshed, one by far the stronger, which is America, but that does not mean that socialists should end up on the side of Putin or of the leader of China today and so on. Therefore, the view that we take is the same view as people like James Connolly put it. We are against all imperialist powers, but we put our own at the top of the list. We see the main enemy as American imperialism, but we will not fall for the idea that is now sometimes emerging on the left, that somehow Russia is an anti-imperialist power, or for that matter, China in the future may be an anti-imperialist power. I think it's important to say that, because any attempt, if you like, to fall back into a version of Stalinism that pretends there's only one imperialist power, it's not credible in terms of the mass of people at the moment and so on. So therefore, imperialism as a system. The last point I want to make is just to come back on the left-wing mythology after 1989, that there is simply America rules the world. It was never the case. It was not the case in the 90s, and it's certainly not the case today. What we find is the problem for American capitalism is that in terms of its share of the global economy, it has been shrinking essentially since 1950. In 1950, American companies ran approximately half of all manufacturing. They were by far the dominant power. Today it's down to about 18% of the economy. They face greater rivals in terms of Germany, Japan, and now China. Their strategy was to compensate for if you like, economic weakness by military power. The whole basis of the Bush regime, of the Project for a New American Century, the neocons who took control of the Pentagon and the US state in the 90s, was to lash out, gain control of Iraq, use their control of the oil supplies of Iraq to gain leverage, gain pressure over China, and through that gain concessions for American industry. And we have to say that project failed. The Americans lost the war. They have lost completely in terms of what happened in Iraq. They've left a bloody mess behind, but the project of, if you like, using their overwhelming military domination, the fact that they spend more on weapons than all the other main rivals combined, has not actually worked. And therefore we are living in a world where imperialism has been weakened. It's nasty, it's vicious, it's violent, but it's much weaker than the past. And therefore you find this dynamic that Memet has described dramatically, where they want to do something. They wanted, for example, at one point to intervene in Syria, then they pull back. They are terrified of their own economic weakness, and crucially, they are terrified of the, if you like, the opposition of much of the Western population to actual military intervention. This is why, classically, the imperialists want a nice, clean war for people with white faces, where you can drop drones on people or drop bombs, but you're not willing to put your own troops into these ground situations. That reflects their actual weakness. They're not able to command their own population. Their economic weakness, their economic weakness I've already mentioned. And therefore, just to finish, the view that we have at the moment is that we live in an era very similar to what people like Lenin confronted in 1914. It is not, sometimes when you're a socialist, it's easy to be popular. We're very popular at the moment. Water charges, everybody agrees with the left. But there are times you have to be unpopular and willing to stand up for your principles. And when people tell you, and people use it, and the media is expert, and it's like whipping up the PR machine, tugging at our emotions, pushing us to support imperialism, we always have to stand very fast and say, we are totally against imperialism, we stand very clear on that side. And when it comes to a conflict, an emerging conflict between Russia and China and so on, we take the exact same position as people like Lenin did in the past. This is a conflict between slave owners who want a better share of slavery. We're not going to join one side, we're going to stand on the side of people fighting both imperialism.
When people say, well, what can you do? I've often thought that actually what you could do is primarily actually where you're living at the moment. I'm not saying now that all the arguments put forward are absolutely valid. But the key issue that we could do something about now is in Shannon Airport. And it's always been the key. Like we would have been to Chicago, I was in Chicago a few years ago at an American peace conference. And they all knew about Shannon. They all knew that the US troops, millions of US troops have passed through Shannon Airport. And that, in terms of not just internationally, but also domestically, is something we can actually do about it. It's only down the road. And a group called Shannon Watch have a demonstration there on the second Sunday of every month. And it's actually one of the areas that we need to focus on in this country if we are going to be against imperialism. Because while we should obviously, say for example, support the Kurds in their struggle against the ISIS, you know, that's kind of abstract, you know, in a sense, you know what I mean? But here, now, there is Shannon. There are an interesting change, for example, like the current Fine Gael Labour government, they have adopted an aviation policy. It is the formal policy of this current government to seek additional military aircraft through Shannon Airport. That's their policy. They want more war. They're committed to more war. Now, you hardly ever read that in the corporate media. That doesn't come as a surprise to anybody here. But that's an absolute reality. Varadkar announced that policy in 2012 when he was then the Minister for Transport. So we have now a government that's even more in favour of collaboration with imperialism than anybody. So if we want to do something to oppose imperialism here, now, then I think a greater effort should be put into focusing at least just once a year, because I know there's a lot, you can't do everything, and I accept that, and you know, I wouldn't blame anybody for campaigning on the water charges issue now. I think that's not unreasonable. But nevertheless, if you're going to come to a conference and talk about global issues and the growth of imperialism, well, there is Shannon Airport, and that has to be returned as a focus of those people who are against imperialism. So again, I would actually recommend people consider going to Shannon at least once a year, if not more often, especially to support Shannon Watch, the second Sunday of every month.
I agree with what you were saying about imperialism being dangerously, recklessly equitable and non-discriminatory about the fights that it picks and the enemies that it chooses. And historically, it's sided with the forces of reaction and the suppression and mutilation of the forces of revolution. But if, say, it were to work inversely, would that still be a reactionary maneuver? And also, wouldn't it be as imperialist not to intervene in a country that has seen a lot of hegemonic and influence and control, like Iraq, since about, I guess, 1963, with the destabilization of the Abdul Qasim regime, than it is to militarily intervene? Wouldn't it be as imperialist not to intervene as it is?
No. I mean, it's a good question, and it's difficult when you look at the situations not to be tempted in that direction. But I'd say two things. First of all, the big powers only intervene in their strategic interests, right? They don't intervene in parts of the world where there's not something at stake for them, even though there's horrendous things going on. But even when they do, they only do it in order to further their own interests. So there is simply no example that I think anybody could cite of benign imperialist intervention, because they always end up backing forces that will suppress the local population. And you know, the intervention you mentioned against Karim Qasim is a classic example of that. Is that the people were talking about nationalising their own oil resources, and this prospect was the most horrifying thing for the Western powers. Was the idea that the people of Iraq, and more generally the Arab world, would gain control of their own resources. The Western powers, that is the thing they fear more than anything else. More than ISIS, more than any paramilitary group. If you were to say, what is the strategic priority of the Western powers in the Middle East since oil was discovered, it was to prevent democracy, prevent self-determination, because any form of democracy or any form of self-determination in the Middle East means that Western oil companies lose control of the most precious and valuable resource in the world. So they will do anything to stop that. And that has been the consistent pattern in every single intervention. So to imagine the leopard will ever change its spots, it will not. So if you want to call it our intervention has always been to be, just as we were saying last night about here, is to actually retain our faith and belief in the mass of people in those areas and their capacity to sort out their own problems. And to, insofar as we can intervene, is from a distance, is to oppose anything that strengthens the imperial power and therefore weakens the hand and the capacity of people in those regions to fight on their own behalf. And that does mean, as Roger said, trying to stop Shannon being used as a pit stop for the American war machine. And by the way, this is where it relates to, you know, questions of politics and so on domestically, making that a red line issue. There's a lot of discussions about what should be red line issues come the next election, right? And people who are verbally against water charges, but is it a red line issue or is it not? And then the people rise up and then suddenly it becomes a red line issue. But I can tell you for us, and I suspect we will be almost alone on the political landscape, no troops, US troops at Shannon is a red line issue. We will not be part of any government or any coalition that allows US troops to continue in Shannon. And we will stand up to them. And we have to make that a red line issue in the run up to the next election. But there are a few other things we can do to intervene. The boycott of Palestine, of Israel. is absolutely critical as well. This is something concrete we can do. The boycott movement is gaining ground all across the world. The payoff, where the mass of people understand, are beginning to understand, Israel is an apartheid state, it's a tool of imperialism in the region, and that Palestinian people deserve self-determination. And therefore, that's a red line issue for us as well. Boycott Israel. Diplomatically, economically, politically, in every way, break off relations with them and isolate them in the same way as apartheid South Africa has done. And by the way, that would be a much more concrete intervention. You know, if you ask, how do ISIS gain political support? Now, let's say it by saying, oh, we're champions of the Palestinian cause. They're not champions of the Palestinian cause in reality, but the fact that Palestine is a running sore for the massive Arab people is something that has been used by reactionary forces, including dictatorships all over the region, for decades. You know, every single dictator in the Middle East has said, oh, we're for the Palestinians, even though, in fact, they did everything to crush the Palestinians in their own country and collaborate with the enemies of the Palestinians. So the issue of the boycott both is a way of isolating Israel, supporting concretely the Palestinian people, and pulling the rug from under people like ISIS. And the very last point, I do think we should take up the Kurdish thing, because it is concrete. It's concrete. We should be saying the Kurds, because they are the only people, progressive force, that are actually fighting and defeating ISIS in Kobani and cases like that, with women, men, they're multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and so on. So we should be saying the PKK should be taken off the international terror list.
It's kind of come to our attention that there's a Galway Airport has put in a bid to make a drone testing facility into Galway Airport. It's just been in the newspaper and posted on social media. That's not happened yet, but it would be a good thing to get behind. And also, the reason why our government didn't really do anything to speak out against Israel is because we make money from Israel. We send hardware there. This is something that's always in the background. No one knows where the buildings are, where they make these weapons. We have an arms trade in this country. We call ourselves neutral, and our neutrality isn't real anymore. It's just non-existence. You know, because what we're actually doing is we're profiteering from war. You said about the oil being our most precious resource. It's not, and never water is. Like, mankind follows water. Wherever water is, that's where we set up house, cap, whatever. Oil has only been around for maybe a couple of 100 years or less, you know what I mean? So we can exist without oil. Like, so, you know what I mean? But it does, as the present system, and because we rely so much on this fuel, we have to find other technologies, and we have to keep pressurizing our government to stop relying on oil, because this is what it's causing the conflict. It doesn't come from here. Unless we have our own oil, we shouldn't really be interfering in other. So that could be another. That's it.
Just a couple of things. I mean, just following up from what Kieran was saying about our understanding of imperialism, and how useful that can be in a practical situation. It's not just a theoretical formula advised by Lenin almost 100 years ago. It still plays out in the world today. So I think the key thing is understanding imperialism, not just as a policy choice, as he said, but as a part of the system. It's the logical conclusion of the way capitalism works. And I think it's when the world becomes when the most basic process in capitalism, the accumulation of capital, accumulation of wealth, develops to such a point that you have these huge monopolies, we all know them, and they start carving up the world between themselves to expand their profits. And once you understand that, you avoid certain traps that you can fall into. Like when I think it was a year and a half ago when the French invaded Mali, what they did, some socialists on the left in France supported that invasion. They supported that imperialist intervention. And why did they do it? Because, if you start with the fact that imperialism is a policy choice, it's a bad policy choice that we disagree with. It's not part, and you don't understand it's part of the system. Well, then when you have someone like Francois Hollande, a supposedly left-wing president, what you're able to do is you can dress up imperialism in sort of left-wing progressive language, and you can say that we have to intervene in Mali to defend the Mali people against reactionary Islamist forces. And so, you end up as an apologist for imperialism based on supposedly progressive, but in reality, racist argument of Islamophobia. And so, so you have to avoid that by understanding that imperialism is never progressive. It's always part of the system. It's always about capitalism. It's always about the interests of the ruling class. And so, following up, and so the conclusion for ourselves is that in every instance, in every circumstance, we unapologetically oppose imperialism. And I think this comes back to what yourself and Richard were saying. And I think it's an interesting point. What about when, we always talk about imperialism intervening on the side of reaction, but what about in progressive situations? Like the Arab Spring, when the US supposedly came out and supported democratic movements in the Arab world. But this gets to the heart of how we actually oppose imperialism. What agency has legitimacy to fight imperialism? It's not about letting someone like Francois Hollande. It's not letting a progressive party is going to do it for you. Because once that happens, once you put a party like that into government and they get tied up in the logic of capitalism, because imperialism is a part of capitalism, you just end up in the logic of imperialism. And that's why successive governments, whether the Labour Party is part of it or not, support it, is implicit in shouting out for. So, what is the agency that can actually do it? It's ordinary working class people across the world. It's the Arab workers, it's the Kurdish people, and I don't think it's abstract. I think it's a living day-to-day struggle of Kurdish people fighting against ISIS, not just for their national freedom or for their sovereignty, but for their lives. And that is a struggle against imperialism. And now the US is saying, well, we support the Kurdish people against ISIS. But there's an old Kurdish saying, we have no friends but the mountains. Where was the West for the last 50 years when the PKK were fighting for Kurdish freedom? They were calling them terrorists. And they're supporting their allies in the Turkish government, who are the worst oppressors of the Kurdish people. So it's the Kurdish people, it's the Arab workers, it's people all across the world in oppressed nations who have the agency to defeat imperialism. And the only way to defeat imperialism is to defeat the system that gives birth to it, it's to defeat capitalism, and it's a revolution of working class people and to bring about a socialist society, and that's the only way we'll ever defeat imperialism.
Just very shortly, two things. One about the Kurds, because I agree with you very much that historically, that I agree that we should of course support the Kurds, but as you also said, the militaristic fight or the struggle for survival of the Kurds are not what's going to bring about change or peace in the Middle East alone, and the Kurds have always had the they always ended up playing the role of the what are they called, the smallest pieces in the chessboard, what are they called?
The pawns.
The pawns, okay, yeah. They always end up playing that role because we've had situations before where the Kurds have been brought up and they came out, they're the ones we should support the Kurds, and then afterwards, as soon as imperialism in the West have had their way, they're discarded again, and then they can be sacrificed. So that's one thing, and then the other thing, I think it's very important that we're very clear on the imperialist thing, but I think. And of course, when the left all over Europe end up saying, oh, what's going on in the Middle East is so awful, we should do something. Something must be done. So we have to vote for bombing Iraq again. Even the left wing party in Denmark, which used to be very radical and good people, ended up voting for an intervention. They pulled the support afterwards because it weren't in the right way, but they support it because we should do something. And I think it also comes down to, of course, understanding imperialism, but also comes down to the reformist ideas that they do not see the working class and normal people as the only force that can bring about change. And I think the problem is that revolutionary ideas are in such a huge crisis. There's no one talking about change coming from below, and they just don't see it. Even progressives, socialists, reformists, left reformists, people, they do not see that it's an actual possibility that the people in all over the world can bring about change for themselves. situation is that the Socialist Party supports bombing, but only for a short time. So I was just going to comment. You said that oil is the cause of the wars. It's not. It's imperialism, like you explained. It's the need for profit, you know? That when oil is not a factor anymore, people are going to fight about water. Because water is just a very scarce resource. In general, it's just that oil makes more money right now, but if oil didn't make money, water would be the whole issue. I was just going to say something about what you can do in your own country. Well, I'm not an Irish resident, but I'm a Dutch resident, and in this weekend, earlier this week that I'm gone, there's going to be a massive protest at one of the biggest conference centers in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, where all the arms merchants are going to come together and have a gigantic meeting and blah, blah, blah. We're going to have a gigantic protest, pro-Palestine protest, anti-arms protest, that actually is very reminiscent of the anti-war sentiments that were in 2003 in the Netherlands that made the social movement so big. And I think that what you can do in your own country, like here, like is just completely go ideologically against the arms trade, because that's feeding into the imperialist wars. Every time a war starts, Halliburton shares go up. So that's what the global elites, the imperialist forces, are just profiting from, and exposing this and having people rally against that would be a very good strategy to start with, and also to support Palestine, because it has the same exact purpose, the same exact goal. So that would be
Just come back then. First of all, what Roger Cole was saying was right. We should be highlighting Shannon, and we should be always thinking what we can do about it here. And we should take every opportunity. But I also agree that building the BDS movement, the boycott, disinvestment, the sanctions against Israel, is definitely the way to go right now. If we do one in Cork every month, and the last Saturday of every month, and it's very, very successful. And when the big marches came against the invasion earlier on this year, they you know, because they already existed, we were able to bring in, like, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but we're talking about 100 people on an actual BDS day on one particular occasion. And again, it's just another example of what you can do in the here and now. But the other thing I was thinking of is, I was coming up this morning, I was reading the Irish Times, and I was reading the way they're going to commemorate the 1916 thing. We have a little bit of history of anti-imperialism ourselves. We do know a little bit about it. 100 years ago, in fact, we picked out one of the British, one of the main imperialist armies in the world. And I mean, one of the things about anti-imperialist struggle, of course, is it draws people into struggle against the system, ultimately. And this is really what frightens people. And it's very obvious what the Irish establishment are doing at the moment in terms of 1916. Totally desanitize, take all the revolutionary instinct, all the anti-imperialist components of that struggle out of it, and turning it into a gathering part two, basically, a kind of, marketing. The guy in charge of it is a marketing expert who's trying to figure out how we can bring most people into the country, spending their money and all that sort of stuff. What we should be saying is, 1916 was an anti-imperial struggle, and imperialism is still a feature of the world today, and we should be shaming them for what they're doing in Shannon. We should be, I think the left will have something to say about this, or should have something to say about this over the next couple of years. It's not that far away, actually. It's just over a year away. That if that's the way they're going to go, we should have our own thing going, which is actually no. This is what anti-imperialism. This is what 1916 is about, and what it's still about today.
And the relatives in the book
Like what we can actually start getting on work. We understand the injustice of imperialism. Like, let's get something done about it. And what you guys are doing is great. But I think Sinn Féin, particularly with their history of fighting against British imperialism, and they've been like, it's been embarrassment what they've done with the water charges. They're looking like they're getting empowered to they're looking at power. So I think we should have, which you said, like a red line issue, and people themselves are high profile in people for profit. Call them to charge, like, where is your red line? They're sitting down with President Mary MacDonald referred to Barack Obama as the leader of the free world. I felt with some
term when I heard that, and how they've come from that place of fighting for social justice, left-wing justice. And I think now's the time, because not just to discredit Sinn Féin for the sake of discrediting Sinn Féin, but I mean just to bring the agenda. We don't want bloody plain landing in Shannon. So I think the key, very good timing now to pull them to a line. What's their policy? You don't sit down and agree. Simple as that. Excuse my language.
Read Liberty, the SIT2 newspaper. They're very good on anti-imperialism, but when it comes to the actual on the ground, they're not good, and they haven't done anything about Shannon or tried to highlight it, kind of in practical terms, just pay lip service.
Important, and thanks for reminding us actually about Shannon. But at the same time, we have been to Shannon. I mean, for example, the Irish Anti-War Movement, various other groups, etc., have been to Shannon. It's one of our items that we not necessarily campaign all the time in various campaign groups, but it is important. Also, not to forget, I mean, from the river to the sea, Irish water will be free. What a brilliant slogan that the Irish people can come up with. That, of course, refers to the memories of people and their hearts that is also beating for somewhere else, right? Yeah. I mean, only a few months ago, there were 10,000–15,000 people on the streets. So I think we should not pat ourselves on the back, but there's this consciousness, I think. But you're absolutely right. I think Shannon has been for long and for too much abandoned a bit by the progressive forces in Ireland. Absolutely, we should do that, right? See, the thing is, sometimes we get this criticism about when we deal with our own imperialist rulers, right, rather than the faraway ones. But isn't ISIS bad? Isn't this, that, right? Why do you go about American imperialism? You see, the problem for the Irish workers is not that they're going to turn into radical Islamist jihadists. They're going to be poisoned by Western imperialism and its agenda. And they're going to be, through that poison, be divided and be split and lose their own gains that they have been fighting for decades, right? So, therefore, we have to see this danger, first of all, very clearly and realize that our task is not to let our own rulers, the closest to us, to get on with that, right? So that's important. Of course, then we can deal with everything else. But, that's, I think, is the priority, right? The other thing is as well, I think the West has discovered the Kurds. One of the longest, bloodiest, most brutal 40, 50 years of a people who are divided through imperialist division, of course, 1914s, 15s, 17s, right, through borders, into Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey, having sort of banned their language, their ethnic, religious, cultural identity. When I say banned, I mean you are killed. You are killed if you spoke your own language. You are tortured, imprisoned. To this day, they are fighting under military barracks bones of people who have been missing for the last 20 years. To this day, this is the 500th week of Saturday mothers of Kurdish women in Istanbul, gathering every Saturday, a bit like the Argentinian situation, looking for their missing sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, or husbands, right? So the Kurds didn't necessarily be the smallest piece in the chess game at all times. They have fought. Now, interesting enough, they have fought some imperialist powers, and sometimes they have fought very strong imperialist powers. They have been declared illegal since the modern day struggle has started. They have become terrorists, and 40,000 people have been killed. But to this day, they have continued their rightful fight, military fight and political fight in various parts of the region, and they are winning. And that win and that defense of Kobane is extremely tangible and extremely important in a sense. The reason for that is, if we say no to US imperialism, no to ISIS sectarianism and radical Islamism, yes to grassroots people revolt in the region, the spark may well be coming from the Kurdish struggle. That's why it's important. It's not just an academic sort of support on Twitter to send to the Kurds, but that's why it's important. And its practical, I think, application may well be Shannon, in a sense. I mean, obviously, we have to make that linkage. But it's seriously important. What Richard said is seriously important. And you know what Germany did? Careful, Richard. A German MP held the PKK flag, and the German court revoked her legal status that she can be actually brought to courts, and her MP status may well be taken off her. That's sort of. Here's Germany, the defender of the human rights and democracy, isn't it? So that's why I think the Kurdish situation is important. It's also important that under extremely difficult circumstances in Turkish Kurdistan, the Kurds run for elections. They got 10% almost of the vote. And they're the highest percentage of women leaders of any party and women public representatives. 98 mayors of around 180 are women in that party. 50% representation. In a Muslim, backward, so-called sort of last century people, but that's why Kurdish people's struggle is important. The women fighting in Kobani are very important, right? In that sense, we can't just, it's not just academic, right? Look, my final word. US is in mess. I think ISIS is in mess. I think regional puppet governments are in mess. And if the Kurds can get something out of it in terms of their national liberation, that will probably give other folks in the area, other people in the area, some ideas of how to fight their own rulers, how to defeat their own rulers, and that's where I think our alliance lies, and that's where our support goes to. Unconditional support, if I may say so.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think the discussion was very interesting, particularly in highlighting some of the difficulties people have in different countries, Holland, Denmark, and so on, in terms of fighting imperialism. The reason why this often happens is that imperialism always dresses itself up in colours that seem progressive. Nobody ever tells you, I'm here to rob you. You know, I want to take more money off you. They say on water, I want to conserve the water. So it's the same with imperialists. Whenever they want to rob a country, they'll say nice things about you. So when the British go to India, what do? They say that the Indians have terribly backward customs, like an Indian widow is supposed to turn herself on the funeral pyre of her husband, and we're going in fighting for women's rights. Lord Curzon, when he goes into Egypt, very much champions the rights of Egyptian women against what he would consider religious ideas. Unfortunately, in Britain himself, is the main guy who fights against the suffragettes. So always, they dress themselves up in progressive colours. When the Nazis wanted to make links with the IRA here in the 1940s, what's our propaganda the Nazis put out? We are for the right. It's not just Britain said this, by the way. The Nazis said we are for the rights of small nations. Britain is oppressing the Irish. We, the Nazi party, wish to support the IRA. When the Russians want to support, stir up trouble in Ukraine, what do they say? We are standing in the great tradition of the anti-fascists, and we are fighting the fascists in Ukraine. Always imperialists dress themselves up in nice colours in order to rob you. And the tragedy sometimes is that people fall for it. I mean, people may not understand the context in Holland. The Socialist Party in Holland is not just your usual Labour Party type Socialist Party. This is an organisation that came out in 1968, was among them, all the Maoists and all this sort of stuff, claimed to be really radical left-wingers, and now supporting a little bit of bombing. Okay? So we have to be very, very clear on this issue. Imperialism is not just a policy choice. It's not just that some good or bad people decide we want to help other countries because they're humanitarian. Always it is about a drive to take control of parts of the planet because the political and economic power of capitalism gets few. So we are always against imperialism. We are often on the side of people who fight against imperialism, but we don't think people who fight against imperialism will always carry through that fight to the end. I'm not the least bit surprised by Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin will be the new Fianna Fáil. I can tell you that, sorry. I can tell you the reason why I know that is that Fianna Fáil spoke more radical in 1926 than Sinn Féin speaks today. People will fight against imperialism, but unless they're socialists, they only want to fight against imperialism to get their more equal patch of the system. The socialists are the people who fight against the imperialist system, all forms of imperialism, and we will carry through the struggle. We will not just fight against British imperialism, we'll fight against American imperialism, and we will fight against a system that gives rise to it. The last point to make really is on the Pat's point about 1916 and so on. Absolutely right. Commemoration, historical memory is particularly important in this country. And it's already started. Should you wear a poppy? Has anybody ever come across these type of discussions that are now starting? You know, the media creates these great debates. Should we or should we not wear a poppy? Why the hell should we wear a poppy? I mean, of course people say to you, because we want to commemorate the dead and their families. And of course that's a decent humanitarian thing. But what about the 350 or 370 people who were shot dead for being cowards? Some young 17-year-old executed by the British state for being a coward. Maybe we could commemorate this poor character rather than wearing a poppy. So all the time they start off this softening down, getting used to thinking, you know, the First World War was not quite an awful, horrific carnage and so on. And similarly, they'll start the same thing in 1916. On one hand, we have the crazy John Bruton saying, you know, 1916 is a terrible thing, and then we have the other lot saying, oh, it's a great tourist opportunity, right? And Pat's absolutely right. We have to defend the idea. We don't agree with everything Warwick Pierce said and so on, but when it came to it, in terms of where the blood sacrifice was going on, it was on the field of Flanders and the fields of the Somme, and what do we do? Whatever we think about the particular policies, these people were resisting imperialism. And of course we should honour it, but honour it also by carrying that legacy into the struggles today about Palestine, against resistance to American imperialism, and yes, a resistance to American warplanes in Shannon.